Welcome. You all know that you're here for Western classical music and anime, right? Cool.
Yeah, so
Excellent.
if you're not here for that, it's totally okay. Like, we won't take offense if you just get up and walk away. It's happened plenty of times before.
There was one time we were next to an AMV panel, and about 3 people realized they were in the wrong room.
So they just got up and booked it for the exit. And I was like, bye, have more fun there, hopefully. Anyway, so let's do our round of introductions.
So, my name is Caitlin Farthing. I'm an art conservator and art historian. I've been a weeb since I was about 12. So being an art historian and a weeb, you spend a lot of time analyzing why things look the way they look when you're watching cartoons. And this is my husband.
Oh, you ruined it. Spoilers, dude. So anyways, as I was saying, my name is Alex Abdullayev. I am an actual doctor, but not of medicine. So my degree is in music history. I spend my free time analyzing music, which sounds way more exciting than it actually is. I also teach various music classes at least 2 universities, possibly a 3rd one. And my weeb cred is that I know that anime exists. Like, I'm vaguely aware of it, but that's it.
So this panel is not going to be PowerPoint based. We're going to talk a little bit, we're going to play a clip, we're going to talk about it. So don't worry, there's no notes to keep a track of or anything like that.
Okay, so we're going to start with kind of a very brief historic crash course of Western classical music and the history of Western classical music as it relates to Japanese culture. Basically, without inundating you with too many boring details, is that there is a particular reason that anytime you see a scene in a movie or a TV show that's somewhere classy or somewhere fancy, there's usually going to be a string quartet playing in the background, or if you see like a historic film or like a history sort of like a documentary, there's going to be like a harpsichord thing going on. And the reason for that is that classical music has very specific connotations in Western media, such as Western cinema, Western animation, Western TV. Because classical music comes from a position of privilege. So this has always been the case. Ever since the Middle Ages, when classical music has kind of like started its nascent roots, we've kind of had this connection with a status and privilege in classical music. So you'd basically have monasteries that would roughly speaking, subsidize the transcription and arrangement of classical music, which at the time was Gregorian chant. And notice what's interesting about that is that we know what Gregorian chant is, right? I'm sure all of you have at least kind of like in passing heard of Gregorian chant, but we don't actually know what vernacular music sounds like from the Middle Ages because it was considered low music. So music written by educated people kind of has its own sort of recursive tradition where like you have to be educated in order to be connected to classical music, but in order to be connected to classical music, you have to be educated. So like the two things kind of go hand in hand. From there we go to the Renaissance period, and the Renaissance period is kind of interesting because there's the additional element of money being thrown in, particularly when you're dealing with the Medici family in Florence, who were among some of the wealthiest donors to the arts. They had a lot of money and they wanted to establish their cultural significance in the city of Florence by basically throwing just sacks of florins at whatever artists they wanted to hire, and basically buying out all of the really significant works. And so if that sounds familiar to you, I mean, I'm sure you guys are kind of like drawing parallels between the Epic store and what's going on between Epic and Steam right now. So money really does have its privilege, and so we get to the point where classical music and elitism and privilege and money are kind of associated. You look like you have something to say.
No?
Okay. We also have this added element of religiosity in classic music, which of course we don't really need to talk about in today's lecture, but like by the time we get to the 1700s, the primary patron for the arts is either the Roman Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church. By the classical period, music kind of becomes more connected with taste. So mid-1700s to mid-1800s, we have this idea of taste as an emerging factor in how we appreciate music. And so the appreciation of music is largely connected to what do the people want. And the people are, of course, still the ones who are footing the bill on this. By the time we get to the 19th century, there's this idea of the emerging romantic genius, right? It's this like madman who's toiling away in his room at like 3 a.m, like writing the perfect masterpiece, and everything has to be perfect. There's just like, that's where Beethoven really comes in, and that's where Mahler comes in, that's where Schumann and Schubert come in. So all of these composers kind of contribute to this emerging aesthetic of classical music in the 20th century, in the 19th century. By the time we get to the 20th century, again, we have this connection with elitism because the notion of communicating ideas is very intrinsically connected to the personal expression of a composer. And so by the time we get to the 20th century, you have Schoenberg and Stravinsky, and they're just kind of like, I do what I want, right? I want to write this piece. I don't want to like follow these conventions. And so they're deliberately setting their own standards for composition. And so we have this idea of the composer as a genius transformed into something beyond that.
No, keep going.
Okay. You just keep leaning into the microphone. I'm like, should I not talk?
Pretty.
Dude, that's gross. Stop. Anyway, so in Japan, however, we have a very different understanding of how classical music works, because classical music is not, Western classical music specifically, is not something that's indigenous to Japan. It was brought into Japanese culture by Portuguese missionaries in the 1600s, and then later on by Commodore Matthew Perry in the 1850s. So it was very differently received there. It wasn't something that had a tradition. It wasn't something that had over 1,000 years of history and managed to put down roots and kind of evolve organically. Instead, it was something that was very clearly and deliberately introduced as kind of like a shock trauma to Japanese culture. Japan already has classical music. It has several kinds of classical music. One of them is very clearly designated for the elite class. It's a very different sounding than Western classical music, and it's also something that's very inherent and something that's very, again, for the elite. So classical music from the West in Japan has a very particular role, and it fills a very particular niche that in no way overlaps with Japanese classical music. So they're two separate kind of like, they're two separate ecospheres that you have, and they don't really have very much to do with one another. And that's kind of the background that we need in order to dive into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to be talking about today.
So in the West, we have what's called visual narrative shorthand. How many of you are familiar with that term vaguely? So visual narrative shorthand is basically ways that animators and artists tell you information without having someone physically say it. It involves what you're seeing on the screen and what you're hearing that's not dialogue. And so we've been built up through years and years and years, ever since we were kids, of what certain things mean. The big one that happened recently that there was controversy over is Maui from Moana. In that in traditional Maori stories, he's a very skinny, very small character, but Disney, because they needed to get you information about him very quickly that they did not want a character to say, they drew him as a very large guy because they needed a larger-than-life personality.
Yeah, so visual narrative shorthand is usually something that's typically described as show, don't tell. I'm sure you've all heard that. And as Caitlin pointed out, that's exactly a thing that's been used in cinema largely, and to some extent in animation and other genres, to very quickly and efficiently communicate information.
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is that in Western media tradition and in cartoons and movies, we have connotations surrounding Western classical music. We know what Western classical music means, and it's usually to tell you what you should be feeling about the scene. Western, music is in movies to tell you what you are supposed to be feeling about what's going on. It's not telling you what the characters are feeling. It's not telling you what's going on. It's saying you need to be concerned about this. So you'll notice that like when you watch trailers, you see it on YouTube a lot, people will do these, edit this trailer, but it's a comedy now, and they just change some of the music in the scenes and suddenly it's funny. Yeah. Or they change some of the music in the scenes and suddenly it's terrifying. So that's very, very, very different from the way that Japan treats Western classical music, because again, they have all of that for themselves. They have music, they have their own visual narrative shorthand. And there is a translation between the two, as global as animation is now, there are certain things that are standard across cartoons, movies, things like that. But Western classical music is one of those things that's not. So we're going to talk a little bit about, starting with Evangelion, about what Japan is using Western classical music to tell you versus what, like, the Kowalski brothers would be using Western classical music to tell you.
That's right. Okay. Why don't we go ahead and, well, first of all, you're all familiar with what Neon Genesis Evangelion is, right? It's a story of a boy and his robot and a dad who just didn't love him.
Everyone has trauma.
Yeah, it's literally can be summarized in 3 words. Everyone is traumatized. So without really going into spoiler territory, because I'm not sure if all of you here have seen it, we are going to need to talk about some of the plot points, but why don't we go ahead and watch this clip here and kind of figure out what exactly is going on.
I thank you, Shinji. I wanted you to take Unit 2 from me. Otherwise, with her, I might have survived much longer.
Kaoru, but why?
It is my destiny to live forever, though my survival will bring final destruction to the human race. However, it is possible for me to be killed, and whether I live or die makes no great difference. In truth, death may be the only absolute freedom there is.
What are you? Kaoru, I don't understand what you are talking about, Kaoru.
This is my wish. Please, destroy me. Otherwise, you will be destroyed. Only one life form can be chosen to evade the destruction and seize the future. And you are not the existence which should die. You need the future. It is what you live for. Thank you, Shinji. My life was meaningful because of you.
Okay. Oh, they stopped at the most interesting part.
So, does anyone know what that piece of music is? Yes.
Very good. Fantastic. Wow, you guys are already doing like a million times better than my students at my university.
Those of you who are not familiar may also know it as the piece called Ode to Joy.
That's right. Well, so let's draw a couple of interesting distinctions here. So Beethoven's Ninth Symphony uses Schiller's Ode to Joy as a text for its fourth and final movement. Does anybody know what the Ode to Joy, like what kind of motifs the Ode to Joy addresses? Good.
There we go.
Brotherhood, unity of mankind, all of that stuff. Okay, so let's kind of dissect some of this scene, and we're going to need to talk a little tiny bit about Evangelion, how Evangelion kind of factors into all of this and what the history of Evangelion is. So I'm sure that you've probably kind of like, at least on some level, are familiar with the backstory of the production cycle for Evangelion, and that Hideaki Anno, the director of this show, I mean, he's very much an auteur, and he very clearly had a vision. Unfortunately, that vision, not unfortunately, but it maybe fortunately in some ways, that vision has evolved over time, because as he was working on this series, he started going to therapy and realized that because of the grueling production schedule and because of the million of other projects that he was working on at the time, he started developing PTSD and had to deal with some trauma. And so the plot of the show, of the series, pivoted very dramatically from something that's like kind of lighthearted into something that's very, very dark and has overarching, very serious themes. So like, how many of you have seen the show?
Oh, good.
Okay, fantastic. So no spoiler alerts this time. So you'll notice that in the beginning, like starting with about episode 3 or 4, the tone of the show is considerably lighter than it is in episodes, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 20, and possibly the movie, depending on how you look at it. But the point is that we go from robots pirouetting on aircraft carriers to basically the destruction of mankind. And there's a reason for that. Hideaki Anno had to pivot the production cycle. Also, in the later episodes, you'll get a lot of this stuff, which is like, we stopped it at the most interesting point. Like, something was seriously about to happen, and that is that extended scene with Ava Unit 1 basically holding Kaoru in his closed fist. And, we all know what happens after that. So the point is that the production budget was also basically operating on a shoestring. Like, they were literally running out of money as they were making this, and so there was very little that they could do, and so a lot of this has to be offset. So that being said, that's not to say that Hideaki Anno is a hack. He is very clearly a man with a vision. He very distinctly understands exactly how. I think this microphone is. Yeah, I'm sorry, honey. I'm sorry. So he very clearly had an idea of how to integrate the visuals with the audio, with everything else, and with the motifs. So his choice of music for this scene is very intentional, because notice what happens with the death of Kaoru, right? Mankind is essentially reaching its final instrumentality. Everything kind of blends together into this bloody red goo, and there's a giant ray head in the background. Yay! It's fun. Furthermore, the idea that Shinji has to kill the one person that understands him is kind of a very traumatic experience. So classical music in this scene not only integrates with the overarching motifs, but also supports this notion of profound psychological trauma. Now, notice that the tonal dissonance here is kind of very stark. We have this piece about joy and brotherhood and all of these things, and it's in a traditionally very in a Western sense. It's in a very major key, which kind of semaphores happiness and joy and all this other stuff. And there's none of that in the series, right? In the scene that we saw, there's none of that being portrayed. It's all kind of dark and foreboding, and the tone color is very different. So we have this very drastic dissonance between what the music is telling us and what the visuals are telling us. And so what the visuals are basically telling us is that everything is going to be bad, and the music is kind of creating this sense of tonal dysphoria between the visuals and the soundtrack.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Anything to add?
Nope. You kind of took all of it. We're good.
Cool. All right. Next scene.
Yes. This is also from Ava, and I think all of you know what this scene is. Mouse behave. There we go. right. On that
Why don't we
Corey
maybe
note,
take that off the screen, because I'm not sure. Caption this. Okay, so you want to start by talking about this?
no, go ahead.
Okay, it's on the other screen.
My laptop's doing something funky.
Okay, so how many of you know what the piece of music in this scene is? Yes. You're very close. Right composer, not quite the right composition. Yes, sir. Yes, it's Air in a G string, which is routinely placed on such albums as the 100 top most relaxing classical pieces ever. And if you think this is accidental, well, I have news for you. It's very intentional.
Keep going.
Okay, so pretty much from the get-go, you see very similar themes. There's this idea of tonal dissonance between what the scene is telling you, what the music is telling you, right? Again, Air in a G string is very deliberately kind of like slowly paced, very languid, and sort of amorphous, right? It's part of a cello suite, or not a cello suite, I'm sorry, it's part of an orchestral suite by Bach, which more or less is kind of like very high society music. It's extremely stylized dances. Whereas in the visual component, I mean, we literally have Asuka just tearing the ever-loving bejesus out of prototype Ava units and literally tearing them limb from limb. So what is the significance of this music? Well, again, we have this idea of profound emotional psychological trauma, something that's very dissonant in tone and presentation being thrown at you, the viewer. And while there is a similar concept in Western cinema called scoring against tone or scoring against the action, this goes slightly beyond that. We have something that's a lot more involved and a lot more psychologically deep-seated here. So notice that there's that really brief scene where Shinji is there staring at Ava Unit 1 while Asuka is taking all of the heat off of him, essentially saying, I can't rely on Shinji for anything. I mean, this, in a very big way, kind of, again, reflects a lot of what Hideaki Anno was going through in his production of Neon Genesis Evangelion, but on the other hand, it also sort of reinforces this idea of Shinji's personal trauma. I mean, considering the fact that at this point in the series, we now know that Ava Unit 1 is sort of the reincarnation of his dead mother, the fact that he is essentially repeatedly failed as a pilot and as a savior of humanity, and there's very little kind of that is meant to redeem him to us as something that's not a completely garbage human being. Yes, I am referring to that scene. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So there's this, again, kind of association between emotional trauma and emotional catharsis, which is sort of like what Asuka's doing. So you'll notice that the classical music, particularly selections of classical music, in their tone, in their delivery, and in their use in those scenes are very suggestive of having to reconcile with profound emotional distress and trauma.
Sorry.
You're fine. Okay?
Yeah.
Great.
Do you want to do Shinji plays the cello next?
Sure.
Okay. We have time?
We have time. We have plenty of time. We have 20 more minutes. Okay.
All right. This is the last Ava clip, we promise. We will get on to other things. All right, so that's a little different from the clips we've been showing previously. Does anyone know what that song is? Yes. Yes, Suite for Cello Solo. That is the prelude. Does anyone here play cello? I used to. Anyone who plays cello knows that that is one of the single hardest songs that a cello will ever get to play. It is incredibly difficult. It sounds easy, but it's not. As someone who played cello for several years, I still have stress dreams about learning to play that song. And also, like, that's the only song we ever get to play. Anytime there's a cello solo, like, you know this one, right? That's all we ever get. So this is a very different scene than the ones we've been showing, because even in the color palette, you can see it's bright, it's light, it's relaxed, there's no blood. So
Wait, what?
yeah, so this seems like it kind of flies in the face of the thing we're talking about in that, Western classical music is about trauma, basically. Well, not really, because as someone who's played cello and played the song, this requires an intense amount of practice. To get to this level means that this guy has been playing cello for years and years and years and years. And the fact that he's doing this in the morning to relax, there's a little animal sleeping, having a good time. This is his relaxation. This is maybe one of his ways of dealing with the PTSD that he is most certainly suffering from. So while Western classical music can be a great way to sort of give us this tonal dissonance in anime and sort of tell us, hey, there's themes going on, but also there's trauma. It can also be a way to sort of tell us what the character is specifically feeling and how the character is dealing with the situation around them.
That is correct.
Very useful. All right.
Well, I mean, you've pretty much said everything there is to say about this. I was going to comment on the fact that, from a technical standpoint, that reaching across strings in this piece is incredibly complicated. And there's a reason why. I think it's Pablo de Sarasate is the one. Not the Sarasate. Rostropovich is the one that everybody kind of keeps talking about as the best recording of this work out there. And I don't think that's accidental, because he actually had mastered all of these very technical things about it. And here, it's again, this is, I'm not going to repeat what Caitlin said, because it's basically exactly what we pointed out.
All right, so next. Everyone familiar with the show Your Lie in April? Ooh, yeah, this one also runs along those lines that we're talking about. So this is, I don't know if anyone caught the title that I named this as, but you're going to see why I named it what I did very quickly.
I didn't see what you named it.
I named it, fuck you, I do what I want.
All right.
Wait a second. That is the same song from before. Right? It's the set piece, the Kreutzer. No question. But...
Blasphemous! The tempo dynamics are abysmal! Look, her own accompanist can't even keep up with her! She's dragged Beethoven into a back alley brawl!
Beethoven's Kreutzer. This piece no longer belongs to him. Here and now, she owns it, down to its soul.
All right. So obviously we don't have to ask you what it was, because they specifically said in there it's Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata, which has a very interesting context to it.
Yeah, so let's talk about the piece proper and sort of some of the things surrounding it. It's widely recognized as one of Beethoven's more challenging pieces, because it simply has a lot of contrasting stuff going. It varies wildly between very technical passages and very subtle passages. There's tremendous dynamic contrast. There's lots of very just sort of wildly swinging technical things that goes from intense passage work to very sort of intimate and very connected legato playing. So it basically challenges both the soloist and the accompanist on a variety of levels. And when we're dealing with with chamber music, basically violin and piano playing together, it's not so much about, this is one of the things that kind of bothered me about this, is not so much about the accompanist keeping up with the soloist, it's about the synergy between the two of them. So they have to work together. The challenge of music like this is, can you hold it together and can you both work towards a common goal? So the other thing that we definitely have to talk about is the connection between Kreutzer Sonata, the piece, and Kreutzer Sonata, the novella by Leo Tolstoy, which deals with some fairly interesting motifs. How many of you have heard of the novella by Tolstoy? Okay, it's very good. So just to kind of give you a very quick synopsis, it's a very sort of drag out, very fast analysis of this, and that is that a man is in a marriage to a woman. They are growing apart, very distant, and the woman starts seeing pianist who is accompanying her in the performance of the Kreutzer Sonata. And the man believes that his wife is having an affair with her accompanist. And by sort of being endlessly jealous, he pushes them into actually having an affair. And then he murders them both. Russia. Don't let it be said that we're all about invading other countries. So there's, again, a lot of psychological and emotional baggage in both the piece and in the associated novella. So obviously this is kind of exploring all of those themes. So.
Yep. So also the other interesting thing is, how many of you have done music competitions before, particularly solo music competitions? So you know what that's like. You also know that the scoring that they're using in this is a little bit different than how the way scoring works in the United States. In a music competition in the United States, what you're judged on is kind of dependent on the judges, whereas what they're showing here is a judging system wherein you're supposed to play it exactly as it's written, and you will lose points for every differentiation you give. So if it says piano and you're playing mezzo forte, you're gonna lose points, plain and simple. It's a very by the books, by the numbers way of playing music. So for a character to decide that they're just gonna play it however they want, regardless of what the exact specific rules are, flies in the face of tradition and convention in these sorts of competitions.
Right. Because it's a very proscribed thing. Think about like the Suzuki method and what it's intended to do. The Suzuki method is intended to basically have everybody playing together, but at the expense of having everybody sound the same, right? So Suzuki method is not really the way we do classical music in the Western world. So what that means, of course, is that it's a very different approach. It's a very different system of criteria by which you are being judged. And as Caitlin pointed out, most of it has to do with how exactly and how correctly are you adhering to the score, as opposed to how many liberties you're taking to the score. What is your interpretive freedom telling us about the music? As a pianist with some classical training, I have performed in competitions, and a lot of my marks usually come from like, how clearly do you interpret the intent of the composer, and how much do you express it artistically? Whereas in a Suzuki competition, or in a predominantly Japanese competition, you would probably have something like, how closely do you hew to what the composer's score tells you, which is a very different approach.
Yeah. All right. So, not to spoil the end of Your Lie in April, but that does, for those of you who know, that does very much tie into her personal story, because she is dealing with some shit. And one of the reasons that they talk about in the show is that the reason she plays music is because it is an escape for her from the shit that she is dealing with. So for her to go up there and fly in the face of everything to do it however she wants is sort of, again, like we were showing with Shinji, a way of dealing with trauma. So in this case, Western classical music is not so much the dissonance, it's the giving you an example of what the character is going through. Mm-hmm. So we're gonna sort of bring all of that together in this clip, also from Your Lie in April.
Oh, the notes. They're vanishing. The sound of the piano. I can't hear it.
What happened?
Whoa, he's kind of off.
They're not maintaining tempo.
Kosei, no.
Somewhere inside this robot, who crushed his opponents with unblinking precision, the gear has slipped.
I'm at the bottom of a sunless sea. Death and cold. There's no one else. Just me, alone, in the dark. And now I'm sinking even deeper. They're never going to find me.
All right, back to the scary stuff. All right, so this is going back a little bit to what I was talking about with visual narrative shorthand. This is categorically a panic attack. How many of you have ever had a panic attack before? Yeah, we all know what that was. So we don't have a sort of a narrative shorthand in animation, particularly in the Western tradition, of what a panic attack looks like. There's no quick, easy way of being like, oh, that character is having a panic attack. So for them to animate it the way that they did was, one, brilliant, and two, fascinating, because that is exactly what it feels like. But they jump back and forth between the character having the attack and what it looks like to everyone else. And you can see that the characters can tell that something's wrong, but they don't know what's wrong. And it's affecting the outside performance. So this character, it's not a spoiler really, is dealing with some trauma because music is traumatic to him. Because in this Suzuki method of performing, he was abused by his teacher, who was his mother, into being absolutely perfect. And so playing music is legitimately traumatic for him. So what we're seeing here is a physical representation of the internal trauma that he's having surrounded by this song.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I was watching, as I was watching this scene, I recognized that there is an element of a musicality to this character's performance. For those of you who are not familiar, there has been recently a lot of research being done, like why are certain people more receptive to hearing music and why is it more difficult for others to do it? So like, you'll probably recognize that there's some of your peers who are like much more connected to the music, like they're better singers, they're moving more rhythmically, whatever, and others just like can't seem to find the beat, can't seem to sing on key, all that stuff. And so there's this idea that some people just don't hear the difference between different pitches, which is kind of the key to recognizing, understanding, and internalizing music. And so what occurred to me is that there's a very strong indication, however, maybe it's not supported by the exact text of this show, is that this character is actually a music. So he's struggling. He's kind of like fighting against the current of the music to find the actual theme, to find the harmony, all that stuff. And this is further exacerbated by the panic attack that he's experiencing. So this is a doubly kind of like one of those very powerful and very emotionally traumatic moments for him.
So everyone has trauma. Western classical music, trauma.
Trauma.
We're going to move this to a little bit of a lighter note now. It's just that was a really good culmination of sort of everything we've been talking about so far.
Correct.
So, go away. Thank you. How many of you are familiar with the show Yuri on Ice? We are not going to be talking about the song you think we're going to talk about. Because everyone thinks we're going to talk about the songs that Yuri skates to. Unfortunately, all of the songs that Yuri skates to were composed for the show, which, while they may sound similar to Western classical music, makes them not Western classical music. But there is, given that it's an ice skating show, a fair amount of Western classical music in it. And so we're going to be playing this clip from Otebek's performance.
He is skating to the second movement from Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. Now is the time for you to take center stage. The whole world is waiting for you.
Quadruple toe loop.
He landed it!
Yoko! Have a sec? Can we talk?
Not right now. Find me later. Yuri's about to go on the ice.
Quadruple south cow. Triple toe loop.
You're what? You're coming back?
Yes. I'll time my return to the Russian nationals.
Wait, does this mean the poor Kotlin Bull's going to retire?
Well, that is entirely up to him. He said he was going to make his decision after the final.
Don't let yourself lose sight of what you want. Now is the time to take off.
Okay. All right. Very nice. All right, so obviously they said what song that was. We may have already talked about Beethoven's Ninth a little bit.
Yeah.
So this is an entirely different movement from Beethoven's Ninth.
Yes, this is the second movement. This is the scherzo. So Beethoven's scherzo, by the way, for those of you not familiar, in Italian means joke. Well, Beethoven's jokes are not funny. They're, putting it mildly, Beethoven's scherzos generally tend to be much more on the dark, very sardonic side, and they're very biting. So the second movement from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is, generally speaking, a very very sort of like dark movement by contrast to the first movement. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. It's very polyphonic. There's a lot of contrapuntal ideas. All of this stuff is interwoven, and then a lot of those ideas actually eventually end up coming back in the fourth movement, which on top of having all of those ideas also possesses the sort of like the thematic integrity of actually having text, like actual spoken or sung dialogue that's in it.
All right, so the interesting thing about this one is that it's not really about the music and it's not really about the skating. The important part of the scene is what's going on behind the scenes, where you're talking about Victor coming back from being retired and Yuri potentially retiring. So what was it, the context of this one again?
There's really not much context. It's just,
So,
it's a second movement of a symphony.
The diegetic versus non-diegetic.
Oh, right. So in the diegesis of this, obviously, like the music is taking place on stage, right? Because I mean the character's name. Otterbeck is skating to this piece, but it has significance in the sort of non-diegetic sense, because even though the characters are actually the focus of the scene, are interacting with this music playing in the background, there's not, I mean, the impact of the music is kind of very thematically connected to what's going on, right? Because again, like I mentioned that the character of the second scherzo movement is generally very sardonic, very dark, and very biting, and so you see that there's a lot of tension between the characters, and so the music that's accompanying the performance is actually also accompanying the argument that's happening behind the scenes.
Yep. So, just little tiny fluffy support of our argument. And we've got one last clip, and then we have time for questions, which, everyone remember the show Ouran High School Host Club? So this clip is the reason we started this panel, and we'll tell you a little bit about why afterwards. It's very short, I promise. Oh, I need to make sure that's started back up. This was my, making sure the sound system was working clip. What happened?
With the full screen and then just...
It's okay, we don't really need the video for this.
What happened?
I think we just lost video.
I didn't touch anything.
It's okay. It's all right, don't worry about it. Let's just play the clip.
Okay, hold on.
Womp. Okay, that's okay.
Okay,
That's all right. Let's just play. Let's play. Oh, there it is.
It's
We're
back. We're good. All right, we're gonna do it now. All right. Anyone know what that piece is?
This one's slightly a bit more on the obscure end of the spectrum. So it's Mozart's Sonata K440 for 2 pianos, 4 hands. Anybody notice a problem?
Slight issue with the physically
impossible fact that it's one character playing this with 2 hands on 1 piano.
Yeah, so one of the reasons we started this panel is I was watching this show and he was listening in the background and he heard that song. He goes, "Oh, I love that song. Which 2 characters are playing it?" And I said, 1. And he went, "That's physically impossible." And this led to many car discussions.
Literally impossible in modern science.
This led to many car discussions about piano playing in anime, which led to this panel. So the interesting thing about this is that this does actually tie into what we've been saying. Tamaki as a character, if you don't know, is not Japanese. He's half Japanese and half French, and he is a bastard. He's the production of his father having an affair, but he's also his father's only kid. And his father tried to ignore him for a very, very, very long time. And if you watch throughout the series, Tamaki makes little mentions to the fact that, oh, I'm dripping with good looks, I'm really good at being friendly. The 2 things that Tamaki has been taught that he has value for is being attractive and being able to play music. Those are the 2 things that he is canonically good at. Everything else he's, not got the best grades. People don't seem to love him all that much outside of the host club and women. So what we're dealing with here is that this is one thing that he's good at and one thing that his father recognizes that he's good at. So he is sort of dealing with the trauma of basically being abandoned by doing the one single thing he's good at. And in this particular episode, what's going on is that they're all trying to compete to basically do chores around this little area in the most attractive way possible. And he's losing. He's losing bad because he's bad at all of this.
This show's weird. I don't get it.
It's so weird. And so he's in a huge slump. He's actually in what's basically a depressive episode because he is absolutely terrible at all these things that, any person should really be able to do. And this is the one thing that he can do to bring himself back. This is the one thing that he's good enough at to be able to contribute in some way.
What she said. I mean, I literally don't know anything about the show other than the fact that, like, somehow they're breaking the laws of physics by being able to play a piece that's meant to be played on two pianos on one by one guy. So that's it.
So to sum up, Western classical music in anime.
Everyone has trauma.
Everyone has trauma.
But also, on a more serious note, you'll notice that the significance, as contrasted to like what classical music generally represents and means in Western media as opposed to non-Western media, is very different. There's a lot more subtext in anime that's assigned to the accompanying musical tracks than there is, for instance, in Western media. So in Western media, music tells a story. In non-Western media, specifically in Japanese animation, it focuses primarily on the metatextual and subtextual elements of the emotional response, right? So that's kind of where we are with these. Anything else? Did I miss anything?
No, that was it.
Cool.
Also, trauma.
Trauma's good.
All right. So we have about 15 minutes left for questions and to clear out so that the other panelists after us have time to come up.
Why don't you guys, if you have questions, go ahead and come on up. We have a microphone. Go ahead and ask your questions.
Is this center mic on? I'll test.
We don't know, and if it's not, I will hand you a microphone from here. We have several.
Oh, I think it's on. Okay.
What's that? Very good.
It's sort of, okay, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is the obvious question, but for Nodame Cantabile.
Oh, yeah, that one was pointed out to us a couple times, and I have not found a reliable source to watch it.
Oh, I see. Well, basically, I don't know if you know the context of it, but it's about music university students. So since you haven't watched it, my question doesn't super apply, but I was going to ask you about, because they're in a Western music university, how would the pieces...
yeah, we should check that out. I think it would end up being is that in that sort of situation, it tends to go one of two ways. The music is just sort of there, and it's sort of a framing device. It's sort of like that one show where the girl has the magic violin and that's the only one she can play. And that the songs are not exactly, they may be a little thematically appropriate, but they're not as important to the plot as they are as just having something for them to play. Or every single song is really important and every episode is sort of based around this character's struggle with whatever it is, and that song is very thematically appropriate to that character's struggle. So either end of the spectrum. It's usually not in the middle with shows like that.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
But it's a good thing you mentioned the show because we do need to check it out and possibly add it to the roster if we're going to do this again. Thank you so much.
I will find a 100% legal way of watching it.
Allegedly.
Hello.
Yeah, I kind of had a question more along the lines of like, why is that like the character trauma the main theme that Japanese were able to take on with Western music?
Well,
so probably because they have their own musical traditions for most other things that they're showing. For again, with visual narrative shorthand and audio narrative shorthand, we have ways of showing these things without telling it to you. And in this tradition, Japanese classical music may not be associated with trauma, and this may be one of the few things that they had to sort of get in there and work with.
Slight corollary to that, I think. Very well put. But from my perspective, I don't think it's so much about trauma, but it's also more about having a very powerful emotional response, right? Because, again, the connotation of the music isn't that, it's high class or if it's elitist. It's just sort of like something that sounds strange and different, and therefore it carries with it a very particular emotional gravitas. And some of the most emotional stuff that you could possibly have is, of course, like various episodes that are traumatic, right? Trauma, we respond to trauma in very different ways, particularly psychological trauma. Therefore, combining classical music with elements of emotional and psychological trauma seems like something that would make sense, particularly given the context of all of the shows that we've looked at. So certainly, I can't speak for the others, but I definitely can speak for Evangelion, and that is kind of a very deliberate choice that Hideaki Anno made. Obviously, he also made it because at this point they were pretty much depleted on the budget, so they couldn't exactly come up with new music for the show, so they had to use basically copyright-free music. No, it's true. It's true.
Oh yeah,
but,
that's why there's all those still scenes, like the very famous 2-minute long elevator scene, is because they were running out of money, and so they just had still frames inserted.
Right. But at the same time, it's not like Hideaki Anno was just sort of like, all right, whatever, good enough, right? He is very deliberate in his choices, and he's an auteur, and he is nothing if not meticulous. And so for him to choose that was probably, well, not probably, definitely a very intentional choice.
Yeah. One other thing that we might want to consider is that Western classical music was introduced by people from the West. Yeah. And if you remember Japan's relationship with people coming to Japan from the West, it's not always the most peaceful thing in the world.
It's true.
So there may be a bit of a connotation in Japan, which granted, neither of us is Japanese. We wouldn't actually know. We're talking about what we've noticed from being massive weebs over the years, is there's probably, maybe not the best connotation with things from the West in Japan.
Yeah.
Particularly old things from the West.
This is true. It's a clash of traditions.
I kind of follow-up question, and where does jazz fit in all that? Because I know
This is an entirely separate panel that we're actually in the middle of discussing.
Yeah.
But
if you have about 4 hours, I'll be waiting outside.
his specialty that he wrote his actual dissertation on is music in the Savoy Ballroom. So you found the exact right person to ask.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I could answer that question without literally taking up 3 hours of your time. But let's maybe exchange contact information. We can talk about it.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah,
cool.
Absolutely. Come up here and I'll get your email.
Yes, sir.
Hi. Well, I was actually thinking about asking about Kids on the Slope, but I won't touch that then right now.
Okay, perfect. Deal.
But this is more about original composition, but you were talking a lot about the shorthand. I noticed in stuff like Death Note, you have a Kyrie and a Gregorian chant style.
Ah, yes.
Or you have Elfin Lied with a liturgical text being used.
Yes.
But do you think that religion is being used as a shorthand to convey the message of the thing, or do you think the music is what lends itself to those kinds of pieces?
Yeah, so it's hard for me to actually answer this question with any kind of credibility because I'm not super familiar with those two shows. Death Note is something that I'm kind of only peripherally aware of. Elfin Lied is something that I've watched. I haven't really given it a lot of thought because I was so traumatized by everything that was going on screen. But at the same time, I'm willing to bet that probably it would be probably very informative for me to actually take a look at what the creators of the show were interested in doing with that. But a lot of times, particularly with stuff that you're not, the creators of the show are not super familiar with, it just sounds cool, they'll just throw it in because it sounds cool. So with original compositions, it's difficult to make that assertion because, again, those are original compositions. They usually tend to fall into a separate category than canned classical music, right? And they tend to reflect a different set of values and compositional techniques and practices than music that's already been composed, and so therefore they carry a different connotation. So I'm probably not the best person to answer this question, unfortunately, but my guess is it's probably because they wanted to make it sound like something without it actually sounding that way. And obviously the connotation then would be very obvious. They would have that connotation between this is what religious music means, this is how it sounds, we're going to make something that sounds very similar to that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hello.
Hello.
Your shirt is really cute.
Thank you very much. Kind of a two-part question. One, how is Japanese classical music generally used in anime? Is it more storytelling? And then also, if and when it's used in Western media, how does the West usually use Japanese?
So the second part of that is when Japanese classical music is used in Western media, it's often just to show that it's a Japanese person or that it's a Japanese situation, and it tends to get a little racist with how it's used, so you don't see it very often. You will pretty much only ever see it in shows about, like movies or shows about historical Japan, or trying to indicate that this is a Japanese setting in some way.
Yeah, and Japanese classical music is largely very dependent on context. It's largely dependent on what venue it's being performed at, what audience is being performed at, what time of day in some cases is being performed at. So there's a lot of nuance to the way it's being interpreted in Japanese culture proper. We don't have all of that backdrop information to draw from in Western media. So generally speaking, it's very kind of identical to the way Japan uses it, is that Japan uses Western classical music that is just sort of taking it out of its 1,000-year-long context and just kind of slapping it into something and saying like, okay, good, this sounds like a thing, right?
It also doesn't appear in anime very often because anime is designed to be sold worldwide. And if you've ever heard Japanese classical music, it's not to Western tastes.
It's highly esoteric stuff.
And so if you don't have the history of growing up with it, you don't really know what it is and what it sounds like. So it doesn't sell well. Because I think there was a show for a while about No Theater that did not do well.
That's correct.
So it tends to not show up in anime. And when it does, it's usually to show that this is a serious, like very traditional situation, a very traditional person. I think the one example that we have most often is in Black Butler, when he changes the garden over to be like the Japanese stone garden, there is a little bit of Japanese classical music that plays in there.
That's right.
If you see that scene, if anyone remembers what I'm talking about, that randomly popped into my head. I hope that's an answer that works for you.
Thank you. You have this incredible repository of anime.
All right. Hello.
Hi. So when you were showing the Evangelion clips and I saw Asuka, I was actually thinking you were going to show a different scene.
What were you thinking?
The Hallelujah during mind rape scene.
We tried to stay away from mind rapes.
Yeah, that was just a scene that we really didn't want to show.
So
okay.
You're right. I mean, that is, but that kind of falls very similarly under the same umbrella, right? I mean, again, there's this idea of tonal dissonance, there's the idea of intense psychological emotional trauma, and then we have the happy music, hallelujah, right? It's weird.
It would have been kind of redundant, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
okay.
We could have put that in instead of the Asuka scene that we chose, but we kind of figured that scene was a little less traumatizing for the audience.
Right.
You know,
okay.
A little less, considering that it's Ava and pretty much everything is traumatizing.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Hello.
Hi there. Well, I wouldn't have knowledge about the experience of how classical music would be considered in Japan. I would know that from my experience and from a friend's experience and my father said. My father always said that he never really liked pushing me or how other parents in Asian cultures would try to push their kids to learn classical music. He says you should learn to understand and play your own music. You know, from what he felt, it was he doesn't really know why people this is a sort of meme, but he feels that maybe especially for Asian immigrant parents. It's just this way to show that they made it, you know, and this is definitely something that they would not have been able to do as kids. So they're like, if our kids could play classical music, that would be awesome. But then after a lot of hard work and is sometimes can be kind of painful, suddenly start recognizing, this is beauty, and actually able to play it. And then the parents say, okay, well, now to offer to be a doctor, lawyer, whatever, and then you got to put down the music. It's like, what? I put on this hard work to be a musician and top my studies, and then but it all comes to nothing.
Gotcha.
Like, most people don't play too much after.
Of course, yeah. Well, that's actually a wonderful perspective. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's it. Sometimes, I mean, like again, like as a Westerner, sometimes it's very difficult for me to have that idea because, like in the West, it's like classical music is just something we do. Like it has its own tradition, but at the same time, like it's a thing that kids do, right? And then I think that's a very valuable insight into what the difference is between the two cultures. But thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
And another interesting irony is like many high schools, many of the orchestras started to have a lot more Asian students, just like, and it's almost like, who plays classical music?
Sure.
Well,
it's true. Good. Well, thank you so much for putting that in. All right, so we are going to wrap it up, guys. Thank you so much for coming and for sticking around for questions. We appreciate it.